Hi there, everybody. Welcome. My name is Carrie. I am City Market's Assistant Outreach and Education Manager. I'm the one who's been sending you all of those emails, so now you can put a face to a name, or at least most of a face at this point. Thank you so much for joining us for class tonight. I'm so excited that we're still able to host these classes virtually. It's a great way to feel like we have a sense of community, even when we can't gather together as a community in person. I'm also really excited about the class topic tonight myself, because my allergies are starting to wind up in preparation for the season, so I'm really excited to learn some new things today. If at any time you have a question, you can go ahead and type it into the question and answer box. Once I swing around behind the camera, I'll type a little announcement to that so you can see where it is. And I will see those and I can feed them to our instructor as they come in, or we'll save them possibly for the end, just depends on where they fit. But I will see those and you'll hear my voice from behind the camera, passing those along. I'll send a survey out tomorrow. I'd love to know your thoughts on the class, other classes that you might like to see from us while we're still in this virtual world. So definitely would love to hear your thoughts. But I think without further ado, I will turn things over to Katherine. And again, if you have questions, just let me know. Katherine, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Carrie, for the introduction. So strange to be talking to a screen and not all of you, but I'm really grateful that you're taking the time to join me for this class. And just trying to advance the slides.
The arrow keys on the...
There it goes. So this class is about herbal support for allergies and autoimmunity. It's a class that I love to teach because there are a couple of places where nutrition and herbs can make a huge difference in terms of quality of life for people living with allergies and autoimmunity. And this is a great example of that. Just a little bit about me. I'm a clinically trained community herbalist. I teach herbal medicine at the University of Vermont through their integrative health program. I'm also co-founder of Railyard Apothecary in downtown Burlington, which is another resource or retail apothecary and a holistic health clinic. I also practice as a clinical herbalist there. And then I co-founded a nonprofit called Spoonful Herbals, which is much more about getting folks connected to plant medicine in their surrounding area, helping them feel confident growing and identifying and transforming those plants into medicine for themselves and their families. And Carrie may have mentioned this, but if you have questions at any point, you can send them in the chat box to Carrie and she'll read them out. So happy to take questions during the presentation as well as at the end. And let's get into it. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is this idea of wellness sovereignty, which is the idea that all of us have a right to get in touch with our bodies, understand what our bodies need, and plant medicine is a great way to support what our bodies need for rebalancing because it's readily abundant at our fingertips in our yards or green spaces. And if you don't have a backyard, maybe you have places you can grow in containers or green spaces that you can access. At Spoonful Herbals, we have a network of organic farms that we interact with around gleaning and harvesting weeds to redistribute in our surrounding community. So wellness sovereignty is an opportunity to really take some more ownership over your health and well-being. It doesn't mean that you don't collaborate with healthcare providers for your health and well-being, but in many cases for first aid or common conditions, you can use nutrition and herbs to really improve your quality of life. And at Spoonful Herbals and in my work, I'm really committed to helping people gain that knowledge and confidence. So we're going to be talking more broadly about herbal support for healthy immunity, because that's ultimately where allergies and autoimmunity comes from, is a situation where the immune system is overreactive to a situation that's actually not that helpful. So in the case of allergies, the immune system is responding to allergens in the environment, which may not actually be harmful, but the immune system is treating them as such. And there's also a similar pattern in many of the remedies that we're going to be discussing, especially the immune tonics are also helpful for folks that are living with asthma or autoimmunity. So you can transfer some of this to some of those conditions as well. And first and foremost, healthy immunity starts with a wellness foundation. So many of the remedies I'm going to be sharing can be really helpful for rebalancing and in some cases addressing symptoms, but ultimately as a holistic health provider, the focus should be on eating well, supporting your body to digest the nourishing foods that you eat well, making sure you're hydrating well, not just with fluids, water-based beverages, but also healthy oils and fats, and how we rest, which includes sleep, but also pausing throughout the day to allow your nervous system to regulate, because the stress hormone cortisol plays a huge role in our immune system and how we respond to our environment. And then also attending to our relationships, which can be our relationship with ourselves, with others, the natural world, and also with your work, which could be your paid work, or it could be other ways that you spend your energy in the world. So I don't want to discount the importance of attending to your wellness foundation for supporting healthy immune function. And digestion is a huge piece. So I wanted to briefly comment on often conditions are sort of seen independent from other systems in the body, but digestion can be an underlying core issue. And in my practice as a clinical herbalist, I do a lot of discussions about what you're eating, how is it moving through your digestive tract, what symptoms are you having. So here's a list of indirect symptoms or conditions that can be linked back to poor digestion. And ultimately we want to have that nice digestive fire to help us digest our food adequately, to support the body so that we don't develop some of these conditions. So allergies, eczema, asthma, many autoimmune conditions are often grouped together as atopic conditions, which can be related to poor digestion, which includes poor liver function. Low stomach acid is actually often much more common than high stomach acid, even though acid reflux might be present in a low acid situation. We also see gut flora, or issues with imbalanced microbiome in the gut that can also influence many of these conditions. And of course, the immune system is very active in the gut because it's another place where the outside world is interfacing with the inner worlds. There can also be mood disorders such as anxiety or depression, which are related to digestion. And there's a pretty clear correlation between inflammation at the body level, creating feelings like irritability and anger in the body, in the mood. So that connection between mind, body is very well documented. And then chronic pain is related to inflammation. Also stress and cortisol levels are linked to that. And many of these conditions can be a sign that the body is struggling to maintain balance, and if unaddressed, can set someone up for chronic disease. So it's really worth paying attention to these symptoms and resisting the urge to just address the symptoms, for example, with an antihistamine, and really see what are your symptoms telling you about ways that you might be able to balance your body more effectively. So some things to consider around diet. Generally, foods that help to reduce inflammation in the body are going to be supportive in a situation where there's allergies or autoimmune conditions. I really like this food pyramid from Andrew Whale, who I believe is still out at the Arizona Center for Integrative Health. And you'll notice that the bulk of the diet is colorful fruits and vegetables. Pigments are an amazing source of anti-inflammatory molecules. Then sort of the next layer up is sort of fibrous foods, which includes some grains, but also beans, healthy fats, which are from nuts. If you choose to have fish and seafood or grass-fed meat, that's sort of the next layer up. And then a lot of sort of herbs and spices, and colorful pigment-rich things like red wine and dark chocolate are also included anti-inflammatory. So this is just a brief introduction to this. I teach a more in-depth food as medicine class in other contexts, but this is a really helpful starting point, and basically eating your rainbow, and again, supporting your digestion to assimilate those nutrients effectively. So I also teach a class about superfoods. I love to focus on, because I'm a Vermont resident, really focused on bioregional herbalism and local food, on sort of superfoods that are easy to grow or wild harvest in Vermont, like the reishi and the black currants and the broccoli and the garlic. But one of the things that stands out in these superfoods is that they basically generally reduce inflammation in the body. So adding more superfoods to your diet can be a great shift that you can make to help to reduce the severity of your allergy symptoms and your pain and inflammation in general. Any questions so far?
No questions so far, other than yes, we are recording, and I will put this up on our website at a later date. I'll make sure I send an email when it goes up, but we have a record of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. So just a little bit of general information about where herbs interface with our immune system. And this also relates to protecting the body from pathogens and other influences that can create disease in the body, helping to heal if there's a cut or skin is broken. So we have herbs that help to maintain our boundaries. So these are the healing herbs like calendula that help to re-knit the skin back together so it can do its job of keeping infectious agents out of the body. We also have plants that directly discourage pathogens, antimicrobial herbs, rosemary, thyme, garlic. We have immune boosting herbs. Many people are familiar with echinacea, elderberry, a lot of the spicy herbs. And the important distinction of that these are immune boosting herbs. They boost the immune cells that are already there, different from immune building herbs. So there also are a class of herbs called immune tonics, also immunomodulants. They're all in the same category. These are the medicinal mushrooms. There also are a number of Chinese roots, such as astragalus, that actually work at the bone marrow level to help produce more immune cells, but also to rebalance the population of immune cells, which I'll be talking about a little bit later when I talk about mushroom medicine. And then the role of lymphatic herbs. So these are plants and foods that help to support lymphatic clearance in the body. We can think of the lymph system as the body's waste disposal system, but also the superhighway that the immune cells are using to get around. And in the context of inflammation, it can be really helpful to basically support the body to clear and detoxify, often through the skin and the urinary system, by consuming lymphatic herbs, which I'm going to focus on in more depth a bit later. So immune pathophysiology, things that can go wrong with the immune system. We're not going to be talking so much about underactive immunity, although I want to emphasize that herbs play a key role there. For the purpose of our time here this evening, we're going to be talking about overactive immunity. So when the immune system is hyperreactive and creating many of the symptoms that some of you may be struggling with already because the pollen's out. So we'll talk about allergies and hypersensitivities specifically. So a little bit of background and kind of theory behind what causes allergies and hypersensitivities. There's kind of two schools of thought. One is called the Hygiene Hypothesis. One is called Cascade theory. I'm going to talk about them both separately. But my, professional opinion, and there's a fair amount of agreement among the medical community, is that it's probably a little bit of both of these patterns, which contribute to allergies in our population and in our bodies. So the hygiene hypothesis is based on the idea that a healthy immune system develops in the context of some challenge. So a lot of this comes from research. There's a few articles and citations listed here if you want to follow them a little bit more deeply. But mainly they're finding some of this research was specifically at asthma, but that kids who grow up on farms have a way lesser incidence of allergies and asthma than kids that are growing up in more sterile urban environments. So there's something to be said about exposure to bacteria, especially in childhood, basically shaping the immune system to be wiser and to know the difference between a real threat and something that is just foreign to the immune system because perhaps you weren't exposed to it as a child. So the hygiene hypothesis suggests that it's a good idea to get out there and get dirty, especially as a kid, and that we may actually be harming our immune systems or not giving our immune systems the practice that it needs if we live in a very sterile environment. So discouraging, especially in your home, disinfecting everything, for example. So that's one of the key theories of sort of where allergies or contributing factors for allergies and asthma. So here's another sort of example of that making sure that our kids are exposed to a certain amount of challenge to prevent the development of allergies, asthma, and autoimmunity. And here's a specific article that was in Immunology Today almost 20 years ago. So teaching the immune system not to be allergic.
None yet.
Okay. So the other theory, which again, I think it's a both and rather than an either or, is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back theory. So basically, our bodies are extremely resilient, and they are. We have amazing adaptations to challenge in our environment. But at some point, we reach a threshold point where our body can no longer adapt and maintain optimal function given the challenges that it's experiencing. So I see a lot of this as related to the systems in our body that help to process toxins or challenging chemicals in our environment and in our food supply. So this is often the organs of detoxification, which include the liver first and foremost, but also the skin, the urinary system. So the major detox organ of the liver, it's really helpful to kind of understand how the liver does its job, because it's not only a function of what challenges it's facing, it's also being supported to do its work as an organ. So basically what the liver is doing in our bodies, it's taking molecules that the digestive system isn't equipped to, the rest of the digestive system isn't equipped to digest. So our digestive system knows exactly what to do with carbohydrates and fats and proteins because that's what it's designed to digest. But any other molecules, even some of these plant pigments, for example, the liver has to decide what to do with them. And basically what it does is it sort of sorts through any of these substances, breaks them down in phase 1. And then in phase 2, it connects them to other types of molecules, binds them together so that they can be eliminated either through the urine as a liquid or through the stool as a solid. So it kind of does these chemical reactions to support the elimination process. And what can happen if the liver is overburdened? So if the liver is having to deal with a lot of different molecules, and here's some examples of toxins, contaminants, pollutants, food additives, drugs, alcohol. Also, the stress hormone cortisol is broken down in the liver. The only way that cortisol is cleared from the body without the liver breaking it down is through tears, which is one of my favorite facts, that tears are a really important adaptation to stress and helping to unburden the liver, but that's a whole other side conversation. So once these molecules are broken down in phase 1, they're kind of waiting in the assembly line to be reconjugated so that they can be excreted. And what often happens is if there aren't the molecules that are going to be bound to these phase 2 molecules, then they get sort of backed up in the liver and they don't get passed through. So the liver absolutely can be overburdened. And it's not just recreational drugs, but also pharmaceutical drugs can put a burden on the liver. So these are all just considerations when we're thinking about what might be causing stress in the body. And in my clinical practice, working with someone with allergies, I'm asking questions about level of stress. Is it somebody who is taking oral contraceptives or statins, which are processed in the liver, which would be creating a burden on the liver to clear it out? And generally speaking, leafy greens are a really excellent source of what's called glutathione, which provides a lot of the building blocks that the liver needs to complete the phase 2 detoxification. Other sources of glutathione are medicinal plants such as milk thistle or schizandra berry. So I'll often use those in folks if it seems like overburdening of the liver is one of the leverage points for allergy support. But this idea of the body's detoxification systems getting overburdened as one of the contributors to inflammation and allergies is a really important one to pay attention to. So to summarize, an herbal support for reducing allergy, autoimmunity, asthma symptoms. There's a huge focus on supporting the liver and the lymph system. Again, this is directly related to supporting the body's inherent ability to detoxify and eliminate, basically to prevent that overwhelm, the straw that's breaking the camel's back. There's also an important role for nervous system support because of the role that the stress hormone cortisol plays in creating a burden on the liver and the body. Not to mention that the immune system in general functions much better with frequent periods of rest. So if you're someone that's experiencing allergies and the pace of your life is very fast and you rarely have time for pausing and allowing what's called the parasympathetic or the rest and digest phase of the nervous system to activate and do sort of the housekeeping and cleanup and the immune cell's job. This also happens with adequate sleep. That could be a contributing factor. So what you're probably starting to realize is that the solution for allergies really depends on the person and their lifestyle. And in my clinical practice, I spend an hour or more in the first session with someone to really tease out like what are sort of the key contributing factors and where is support most needed. And it could be either or both of these areas. Often relying on some immune tonics or immunomodulants to support the body with immune cells that are not overreactive and are very wise in the context of allergens is important. And I'm going to share some examples of those soon. And then lastly, and it was really intentional that I put this at the end of the list, providing symptom relief, acknowledging that a lot of these top three can take some time. I often recommend, for the immune tonics, as far as preventing severe allergy symptoms in allergy season, I'm doing medicinal mushrooms 2 to 3 months before the allergy season starts, because you're really restructuring the population of immune cells to make them less reactive once the allergy season rolls around. But it's really important to do some symptom relief, and especially if you're in the allergy season now, you can definitely rely on some herbs for some symptom relief. So antihistamine herbs work just like Benadryl, Claritin, and basically reduce the release of histamine in the body, which causes sort of swelling, inflammation, redness, runny nose. Anti-catarrhal herbs. Catarrh is an old-fashioned word for mucus. So these are medicinal plants that help to thin mucus secretions and really help to sort of move out sort of stuck nasal passages, for example. So there might be a role for those depending on what your allergy symptoms look like. And again, everyone experiences allergies differently. So in my clinical practice, I'll have a conversation about how the allergy symptoms manifest and design a personalized protocol depending on how people are affected. Any question? Okay. So here's just another sort of reiterating the body's detoxification system. So the skin, urinary, and lymphatic systems. Support for these systems, hydration is key. Making sure that you're sweating, saunas are great, exercise is great, using like a dry brush massage if that's part of your practice. But the herbs that support the lymphatic system include plants like red clover or alfalfa legumes. And I want to feature these right now. This is a great time of year, really starting at the Celtic holiday of Imbolc, which falls on Groundhog Day, which is sort of the day that the seeds are stirring. and sort of spring is just on its heels. So I started sprouting seeds on my windowsill right around then. There's some beautiful red clover that I started sprouting at the beginning of the week. And not only is red clover an excellent source of lymphatics, such as coumarins, but also really good source of plant-based estrogens and lots of anti-inflammatory molecules. And if you're someone who really wants to eat local, it's a great way to get your local greens earlier than perhaps the greenhouses and the cold frames are producing them. And I like to use high mowings sprouting seeds. Carrie said that they don't carry straight up red clover here at the Burlington City Market store, but there is this sandwich booster mix, which is available in the produce section. And this has a mix of red clover, alfalfa, as well as radish and mustard. So the radish and mustard would provide other anti-inflammatory, be a great source of the glutathione. So this is actually a really balanced liver and lymphatic support blend. And you don't need to have a sprouting tray that looks just like mine. You can also just get a glass jar and a screen lid. I think all the supplies are available there. But I would strongly encourage this as part of a spring practice for supporting your body's detoxification system, even if you're not someone that's living with allergies. So on the handout that Carrie emailed, I'm just going to email it out again. There were some recipes on the back, including a tea blend that included some of these lymphatic herbs. And this list is basically an order of sort of strength. And with herbal medicine, sometimes the gentler remedies every day is what is called for. So red clover, calendula, echinacea cleavers are sort of gentler plants. Ceanothus and poke in particular, is very strong and in higher doses is a poison. So I tend to use poke for more severe situations of sort of stuck or stagnant lymphatic tissues where there's like a lot of swelling and the lymphatic stagnation has been present for a long time. The other remedy, which I think is really helpful in this category of liver support, but also for enhancing digestion and boosting that digestive fire for a good clean burn of all of your food, are the bitter herbs. So I just want to highlight those briefly. And the main thing to emphasize here is that bitter herbs are classified by taste, not the chemistry. So anything that tastes bitter, that is a plant, will have these effects in the body. This is one of the reasons that many food traditions, especially European traditions, will eat dandelion greens in the springtime. Here's artichoke featured here, but even, motherwort, if you're familiar with that one, is starting to come out this time of year. Anything that tastes bitter will have this effect on supporting the liver and the digestion. And what's interesting about these bitter taste receptors in our body is that they're located throughout the body. They're not only in the digestive tract, but they're throughout the digestive tract. And for some somewhat mysterious and I think magical reason, they're also in the lungs and the brain. So we don't fully understand why we have bitter taste receptors in those places, but really a powerful flavor to be introducing to your body. And so some of the benefits of bitters is that they stimulate digestive secretion, specifically cholecystokinin, so that boosts bile secretion for adequate digestion of fats and proteins, that digestive fire. There's also a toning and healing of the tissue of the gastrointestinal tract, helping to reduce, for example, leaky gut or the side effects of irritation from food allergies, for example. They're generally protective to the liver and supportive and boosting liver function. They also have this added benefit of regulating blood sugar. And not only does that help with energy and helping to protect against cardiovascular concerns and irritation, especially in the arteries and blood vessels, but blood sugar regulation is also closely related to cortisol, or there's a relationship between cortisol and blood sugar. So the bitter flavor can also be helpful with reducing stress on the body from chronic stress. There's also this modulation of gastric motility, so helping to reduce either diarrhea or constipation, helping to rebalance that transit time. And then another benefit, which is helpful to know, is bitters also suppress appetite a little bit. There's evidence that folks who are prone to obesity or have a family, what's the word I'm looking for? Family predisposition to obesity have a lower amount of these bitter taste receptors. And so the bitter taste receptor is really helpful for helping to reduce appetite and boosting metabolism. And in fact, for clients I work with that are trying to reduce sugar cravings or cravings for snacks, I'll often recommend just taking a few drops of bitter tincture, like a dandelion or whatever digested bitter brand you like, just a few drops on the tongue to curb any sort of cravings for sweets.
Couple questions that came in for you.
Yes.
How much of the sprouts would you recommend being eaten per day?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this sandwich booster mix is kind of a good example. Usually it's like maybe 1/8 of a cup. It doesn't take much, especially because you're eating the whole plant. So you're getting a lot of those greens and that benefits, and it's very fresh. So I would just say, kind of grabbing like just what you can fit in your hand to put on top of a salad or in a sandwich, or I'll even just snack on them directly.
Great. And Sharon asks, so I can pick the leaves off the dandelions that grow in my yard for bitter greens?
Yeah, so dandelion harvesting, there's actually a recipe for a dandelion root tincture. You can certainly eat the leaf. The main difference between the root and the leaf with dandelion is that the leaf is a bit of a diuretic as well, which you may or may not want. If you're someone living with high blood pressure, dandelion leaf is a great, basically plant-based natural diuretic that's also packed with potassium. A lot of the pharmaceutical diuretics for high blood pressure actually deplete the body of potassium, so it's kind of nice to get a whole package of dandelion leaf to provide all the nutrients as well as the diuretic benefit, and that can be in tea form. I like to make it in pesto, or you can just saute up the greens. The other important thing of note with dandelion is it gets more bitter to the point of being unpalatable after it flowers. So that's why often springtime is the best time to harvest the greens, although you might notice that dandelions actually go through a few cycles of flowering throughout the season. So there are other times later in the season where you can get the leaf. We also live in a time where there can be pollution in the soil. So making sure you understand the land use history of where you're harvesting the dandelions. Dandelions also detoxify the soil. They don't just detoxify our bodies, and they do that by pulling toxins out of the ground. So you don't want to eat dandelions that are growing in polluted soil, and if you aren't sure, don't harvest there. If it's your backyard, you can usually get a soil test through your local land grant university. UVM offers them for pretty low cost. I think it's like $15. And also if you're living in a home with lead-based paint, then you have to be worried about heavy metals in the soil. So not harvesting around your house in that case. So just to sort of speak a little bit to sort of standard conventional treatment for allergies and autoimmunity, there are the antihistamines, and that's kind of the standard remedy that's available through for conventional treatment for allergies. So Benadryl, Claritin, I think Allegra, yeah, that one's shown right there. There's also the anti-inflammatories. So there are the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories if there's sort of a chronic pain situation or sort of swelling in the nasal passages, but more commonly steroids are used. Like I think about the steroid nasal sprays for reducing swelling in the nose. And they work by suppressing the immune cells and drying out the mucous membranes, which can be helpful for immediate symptom relief, but they also can sort of make the mucous membranes really fragile, makes you prone to other pathogens in the environment because it shifts the integrity of the mucous membranes and their ability to be a good barrier against viruses and bacteria. So if you can find alternatives to these things, and in fact, one of my favorite herbal remedies, which has a slight steroidal effect, is licorice. So when I start talking about remedies, often licorice is included as a gentler plant-based steroid in some of the preparations that I make for allergies. So I wanted to just give a little bit of foundational pathophysiology, or sort of like what histamine is and what it's doing in the body, to demonstrate sort of how the herbs work a little bit differently in some cases than the antihistamines. So if you look at sort of the bottom of this image, you can see the mucous membrane with these little golden mucus cells lined up along the skin. And basically the tissues in the body, so this is simulating a mucous membrane like the nasal passages, it responds to histamine and other inflammatory molecules by producing mucus, by more fluid moving into the tissues, which creates that sort of dry, swollen feeling that sometimes people have. And it's directly in response to histamine, which is produced by these immune cells, such as B cells, mast cells, eosinophils, and neutrophils. Specifically, it's the mast cells that release the histamine. So most of the conventional antihistamines like Benadryl, as well as some of the herbal antihistamines that I'm going to talk about next, they work at this level of basically suppressing mast cell activity and secretion of histamine. And that's pretty much the only sort of game in town when it comes to sort of conventional interventions with allergies. But you'll notice if you work your way further up this cascade, back to where that little green allergen is, there's this phase in between with the Th2 cells. So Th2 cells they stand for helper T cells. And basically what they've found is that the helper T cell, the balance of helper T cells in the body varies by individuals. And they've actually found that people that are prone to allergies or asthma seem to have a higher ratio of helper T cells, helper T2 cells to helper T1 cells, so Th1 to Th2. And that ratio is not actually fixed, it can be influenced. And one of the ways that we influence it with herbs is through these immunomodulants such as astragalus and medicinal mushrooms. So in my practice as an herbalist and my affinity to getting at the root cause of the issue, a lot of my remedies are around finding what the source of the allergy is. So reducing allergen exposure is a very logical way to reduce allergy symptoms, but also restructuring the immune system to have a less inflammatory context. So reducing the Th2 to Th1 ratio with these medicinal mushrooms, and then if needed for symptom relief, bringing in the antihistamines. So this is just a way of kind of sharing the many different ways that you can intervene to make yourself more comfortable and reduce the level of inflammation in your body and in your mucous membranes. So there's the arrow for histamine, there's the T cells, I forgot I had put those in here. So working at the level of the T cells is something that we can do with medicinal mushrooms and certain immunomodulant plants or immune tonics. So here's a summary of what I just shared. And if you're going to take any notes, I would say this is the slide to take notes on because it's kind of like the main strategy here. So, first of all, identifying and minimizing allergens. I'm picking on ragweed a little bit here, and intentionally, for those of you who are wise to these plants, there's some goldenrod pictures sprinkled in there. I'm going to speak a little bit towards the end, but there's often a lot of confusion, and clearly Google has confusion about this, or the people posting the pictures to Google. Ragweed and goldenrod are two different plants. The yellow flowered plant is goldenrod. That does not cause allergies. It's actually a remedy for allergies. The green plant at the bottom is the ragweed, and that one has wind dispersed pollen, which can catch in the nose, and it's usually the reason for late season allergies starting up in August and September. So one of my favorite strategies for minimizing allergens in the body, if you're somebody who is suffering from pollen or pet fur or even mold allergies, try to reduce the number of nights that you go to sleep with those allergens lodged in your nose. So I'll often recommend irrigating with a neti pot or some other saline irrigation device to flush those allergens out of the nose before you go to sleep. And that makes a huge difference as far as the allergen load that your immune system is reacting to throughout the night. You might even try doing more often than that, but it seems like nighttime has the best results for my clients. And the saline solution, the neti pot, is also a great delivery system for these antihistamine-rich herbs. So some of my favorite antihistamine herbs are plantain leaf, different than the banana, Plantago major, and goldenrod. And then I mentioned licorice is a great, sort of subtle steroidal support. So often I'll make a plantain, goldenrod, licorice tincture that can be put in the neti pot water. And that can make a huge difference as far as helping to relax and tone the tissues of the nose. And because you can make a tea of those plants, it just takes more effort. I find that the tincture is a little bit more convenient. And the main thing is that you add the tincture to the salt water when it's still hot, allow it to sit and cool to body temperature, and then the alcohol kind of evaporates off before you run it through your nose. So that's some details right there, and you can definitely follow up with me if you're interested in getting the sort of herbal neti pot solution. I can easily put in a custom order for you at the Railyard Apothecary if you want to try that and see if it makes a difference. The other really important piece, which really gets at the root of the issue, is reducing hypersensitivity in the immune system. So figuring out what is creating the hypersensitivity. Is it poor digestion and detoxification? Is it stress? Is it that the immune system is predisposed to be hyperreactive because of that high ratio of Th2 cells creating a histamine response? It could be all of the above. But I find that really working at these two levels creates a lot of relief for people, especially may not be in sort of the first season, we don't catch it early enough, but by the second season, they're often not needing to use the conventional allergy medication, which is often the goal when people come in and work with me. So here's kind of a summary of the protocol. So you can also have goldenrod and plantain in tea form. And I would say tea with these, perhaps with some nettles. So spring nettles is another great source. And I listed that as a seasonal remedy below there. But you can also put the lymphatic herbs, like red clover is great in tea form as well. And the tea blend on your handout would be a great choice for getting some of these antihistamine and lymphatic herbs in your body. And then mushroom powder. I'm going to speak a little bit to mushrooms as a remedy soon. But I really like to use reishi mushroom powder because it has this subtle, slightly mushroomy flavor. You can also use mushroom slices and make a broth or a decoction. But it's really convenient to get what's called pre-extracted mushroom powder and put it in your cooking. And I'll go into more depth about how to select the way your mushrooms are processed. But reishi in particular, even more so than shiitake or chaga or turkey tail, seems to have an affinity to the liver and really helpful in allergies, asthma, and autoimmune conditions. And the other part of the protocol is that anti-inflammatory diet. So looking at places where you can increase your fruit and vegetables, perhaps reduce fried foods or poor quality fats in your diet, reducing grain-fed meats in your diet, and really trying to emphasize colorful fruits and vegetables as much as possible. If you're someone who's sensitive to gluten and dairy, that might be another intervention, although that's a whole other conversation to sort of look at how many of those common food allergies can just be related to poor digestion. And if we heal the digestive tract, often it's easier to tolerate those foods, which typically might be challenging. And then seasonal remedies. So we're here in springtime. The bitter roots or bitter leaves, such as dandelion, other bitter roots that are great this time of year: burdock, yellow dock, Those are the ones that are sort of classically used. And for Spoonful Herbals, we offer an herbal CSA. We've been offering it. This will be our 7th year offering it in the community. And we always make a backyard bitters formula that features yellow dock and burdock and dandelion because they're so abundant, but also so helpful for digestion, really any time of the year, but particularly in the springtime. And then fresh stinging nettles, great source of nutrients such as calcium, magnesium, and iron, but also antihistamine, particularly in fresh form. So if you're somebody who tends to have worse allergies in the spring, nettles would be a great thing to try as an antihistamine. The best way to use them is to make nettle soup or nettle pesto. The sting goes away as soon as you cook them or blend them. I recommend picking them with gloves until you figure out, you can sort of pick them with fingers if you get up underneath the leaves and pinch off the stems, but it takes a cautious approach. You can also get freeze-dried nettle capsules that are from the fresh plant, or if you're using nettle tincture, it's worth asking if it was made with fresh plant. And ideally, the fresh spring nettles are traditionally the ones that are thought to be most effective as antihistamines for spring allergies. So this is another place to take notes for yourself. Any questions so far? Oh, and then you feel better. What?
Do you think you'll be doing that, the nettle class again this spring, or is it still too early to tell with gathering?
We aren't sure. Usually I teach a nettle class through Shelburne Farms. I'm very happy to share a nettle pesto recipe if it already wasn't on that document. I can't remember what the 3rd recipe was. But basically, if you want to make spring greens pesto with dandelion or nettles or anything, you just find a pesto recipe and substitute basil for a handful of greens. So it's very simple and a great way to consume some of these abundant green plants that have other health benefits. So hopefully if you're using this strategy, then you'll feel great, like this little guy in the yellow shirt. Here's the recipe for wild weeds pesto, and a picture of my son wearing socks and using scissors to harvest the nettles. My son is now 10 years old, but he was like 3 in this picture, so starting early as an herbalist. So the fresh nettles should be popping up in the, maybe a couple weeks, but May is a great time to be harvesting nettles. Again, you want to harvest it from, often they're in wet places, so floodplains that are not super polluted. You can test the soil if you need to. I like to use fresh lamb's quarters and garlic scapes as well, but the garlic scapes tend to come a little bit later. And you can really use any edible spring greens. And I have a YouTube channel through Spoonful Herbals, and there's a video on there about spring edibles in particular. So if you're interested in foraging for some of these nutritious herbs or looking for other options for pesto, you can check out that educational video. There's a few free videos up on that YouTube channel.
Question came in about ragweed allergies. Is goldenrod your first go-to for relief, and is goldenrod in the same family as chamomile?
Let's see. It's testing me. Chamomile is Asteraceae. I don't think that goldenrod is in the daisy family with chamomile. I think that goldenrod is a great remedy for ragweed allergies in particular because there's this pattern of in the natural world when sort of the nuisance plant is present, usually the remedy plant is not far away. That's true for poison ivy, for example, often growing around jewelweed, which is a great remedy for poison ivy rash. So I do like to use goldenrod specifically for ragweed allergies, but goldenrod in general is what we call a mucous membrane tonic. And it just has a lot of properties that are helpful for preventing irritated and hyperreactive tissues at any time of the year.
They are actually related, I think.
The what?
Chamomile is in the Asteraceae, the daisy family, I believe.
And is goldenrod in the Asteraceae?
Goldenrod, yep, is a genus in the Solidago in the Asteraceae family.
Okay, great. Thank you for looking that up. I couldn't remember. They have a pretty different flower shape, but goldenrod has very tiny flowers. So just a little bit of emphasis on these immunomodulants. So these are the immune building, not immune boosting plants. And these are really helpful for working at the immune system level, helping it to be less hyperreactive. And there's a class of medicinal plants called adaptogens, which we often think of for supporting our bodies during chronic stress. Ginseng and ashwagandha are sort of the most well-known in that category of plants. But there's a close, because of the relationship between stress and immune health, there's a close relationship between the adaptogen herbs and the immune tonic herbs. So often you'll see overlap there. So eleuthero or ashwagandha are a couple of my most commonly recommended adaptogen plants, which can be really helpful, especially if you suspect that chronic stress is what might be creating or making your allergies worse. I mentioned astragalus particularly, and that's the plant that's pictured up above here, these sort of tongue depressor slices of astragalus root. And then the plant to the right is the astragalus plant, which is in the pea family. If you know your botany, it has sort of classic pea-shaped structure. So this plant comes to us from the Chinese materia medica, Chinese medicine, but really pretty easy to get. You can get it at the Apothecary. It's also possible to grow here in Vermont. It doesn't grow wild, but you can grow it in some cases as a perennial. Sort of sometimes doesn't overwinter, but it is possible. So this is another great remedy for the immune system. And, you know, just as an aside, there's pretty good evidence that taking, you know, high doses, so a lot of these plants, you're taking like at least a teaspoon a day, and it can be powder or tincture, up to a tablespoon. These are sort of starchy food-like plants. There's some good evidence that taking astragalus on a regular basis supports your immune system enough that it can be a great prevention for Lyme. So if you're somebody who has a job or wants to spend a lot of time outdoors and you get a lot of exposure to Lyme and other tick-borne related illnesses, you might actually consider supplementing with astragalus during tick season, for example. It doesn't replace prevention, which is finding a tick on your body before it bites you, but it can be a helpful protection. Bicol skullcap, different from the skullcap, if you're familiar with the skullcap, that is helpful in like sleep remedies for anxiety. Bicol skullcap is also called Chinese skullcap, and this one is really directly anti-inflammatory, and this is one that I keep in my first aid kit if there would be sort of a sudden allergic response. I mean, obviously, if you know you are prone to anaphylaxis, keeping an EpiPen around is really important. I also tend to carry a Benadryl around in my wallet for this instance, but Bicol skullcap is often in allergy formulas and can be helpful. For example, I had a friend who visited my family home, which has cats in it, and didn't realize he was sitting on the part of the couch that the cats frequent, and started to have you know, an allergic reaction to cats. And I had an allergy formula with Bicol skullcap that he took that kind of calmed the reaction down more quickly than usual. And then, of course, the medicinal mushrooms, but also these liver support and tissue tonic herbs can be really helpful. Any questions before I talk more about mushrooms? And thanks for bearing with me. I realize this is an information-dense lecture, and I can share the slides with Carrie so that you can review them afterwards if you have questions. So when we talk about medicinal mushrooms or medicinally active mushrooms, these are different than psychedelic mushrooms, which is another kind of medicine. Specifically, the immune active varieties are most wild or culinary varieties. So the white button mushrooms are pretty bland in terms of their chemistry. So we're really looking at chaga, reishi, turkey tail, shiitake, maitake, lion's mane. Maitake is also called hen of the wood. So sort of these wilds are often sort of fancy gourmet varieties, tend to have the most medicinal activity. And just a summary of sort of the medicinal benefits of the mushrooms from the scientific literature. is this role of supporting healthy and balanced immunity. And when I say balanced, these are actually pretty effective at boosting an immune response. So they can be helpful in an underactive immune situation to prevent colds and flus and from viruses. But they also have this benefit of cooling an overactive immune response. When I say cool, this is sort of a energy medicine term. A lot of the Ayurveda and Chinese medicine talks about hot and cool conditions. And, you know, for those of you with allergy symptoms, you probably do get red or your skin gets hot, or if you have hives, those are all very sort of like hot sort of responses in the body. So these cooling remedies, and these are the role that the mushroom plays in reducing that Th2 mediated histamine activity. So there's really good evidence in the modern medical literature for medicinal mushrooms playing this role in cooling an overactive immune response. Also some evidence that they're directly antimicrobial, antiviral, and of course you may have heard that mushrooms are really excellent in terms of cancer prevention, as well as supporting folks who are receiving conventional cancer therapy or chemotherapy. So that's just an aside that I didn't want to skip over. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we seem to understand, or some theories for how the mushrooms work for immunity. So specifically for helping to boost immunity, I mentioned that the gut in particular is a central organ in the immune system. So this is a close-up of the lining of the intestines, particularly the small intestines. And we mostly think of them as absorbing nutrients from the intestines into the blood. So these little finger-like structures called microvilli basically just increase the surface area of the lining of the intestines so that it can interface with what's passing through your intestines and absorb nutrients. But you also notice in between these microvilli, these little fingers, there's these patches of what are immune cells. So B cells, T cells, they're called Peyer's patches, or sometimes GALT or malt tissue, which is basically like GALT stands for, or I know malt stands for mucosal associated lymphatic tissue. I think GALT has to do with the gastrointestinal location. And then this slide also shows how inflammation can influence how, so I mentioned leaky gut, that's kind of a side conversation I'm not going to get into. But what we notice with medicinal mushrooms is part of their chemistry includes these polysaccharides, which are sort of long chains of sugar molecules that look enough like the tails of viruses and bacteria that as they're passing through our small intestines, they're brushing up against these patches of immune tissue, which can be kind of like sentinels or something that's sort of looking out for potentially pathogenic substances or molecules passing through. And these little polysaccharide chains will basically tickle this immune system, these patches of immune tissue, and trigger the immune system to be on alert. And that's one of the theories for how mushrooms enhance the activity of our innate immune cells. So that's sort of an explanation for helping to boost immunity and helping the body fight viruses and bacteria. And specifically boosting what are called natural killer cells and macrophages. So those are specific innate immune cells. And then this is a little bit of a review and sort of talking about the Th1 and Th2 cells and how Th1 cells tend to promote the production of macrophages, which are these Pac-Man-like cells that sort of gobble up essentially the debris of the immune system or sort of what's happening in the body, and they help to be, they end up being, oh wait, okay, I'm just looking at this diagram right now. So the macrophages help to sort of clean up the area and end up reducing inflammation, whereas the Th2 cells turn into B cells, which produce histamine, so they tend to be, they can create more inflammation in the body. Yeah, so the Th1 cells are anti-inflammatory by boosting cleanup. The Th2 cells are pro-inflammatory because they increase histamine. So this is just, again, a review of the importance of the ratio of these two cells and the way that medicinal mushrooms help to balance it specifically. Any questions at this point? Okay. So with plant medicine, it's not only about choosing the remedy, but also knowing how to prepare it for optimal bioavailability and assimilation. So obviously there's the general practice of making sure you're taking care of your digestive health for optimum digestion and assimilation, but also preparing it so that the medicine can be delivered to the body is really important. So with medicinal mushrooms specifically, having dried or fresh mushrooms are good, but it needs to be cooked. Mushrooms tend to have, well, they're actually, the cell walls of medicinal mushrooms are made of chitin, which is the same polysaccharide which is in the shells of beetles, the exoskeletons of beetles, so it's quite tough. So getting at that medicine can often take a fair amount of heat to kind of break it down, heat and time. So simmering for what's recommended at least 6 hours for making broth or chai. However, on the marketplace, you can often find mushroom powders that have been steam activated, and those release some of these anti-inflammatory beta-glucan constituents which are in the mushrooms. So I'm going to share some sources of those, or the Railyard Apothecary does sell the steam activated mushroom powder, and that's often what I'll put in blends for my clients when I make personalized formulas. If you're purchasing a tincture or an extract of mushrooms, you want to make sure that you get an extract that's made using what's called a double extraction technique. And the dose as an immune tonic is 1 or 2 teaspoons daily. So you can also get these mushrooms in tincture form if you're not going to make a broth or use powder. So I love to make bone broth, although you could also just use vegetables and mushrooms and make a vegan broth. But this is one of the best ways if you're going to simmer your medicinal mushrooms. You can also kind of collect bones, and you can use, there's carrots and celery in here. You can also just use onions. I think there's some onion skins in there too. What I do is I collect sort of a bone broth. I have a bag in my freezer that I put bones from the meat that I'm eating, as well as onion skins, maybe some carrot tops or the tops of the celery. And then when that bag is full, I put it in a crock pot and simmer it. And this bone broth, you can add the medicinal mushrooms or the astragalus root to that. And then you get this kind of savory liquid that you can drink on its own. I love to warm it up and add miso paste to it for that boost to the microbiome in terms of, what's the word I'm looking for? Probiotic, not prebiotic, probiotic. And then you can also use broth in your cooking. So you can use the same broth in your cooking. Broth also freezes really well. So if you make a big batch and you're not going to use it within a week, then you can put some of it in the freezer. And one trick is to actually freeze it in ice cube trays so that you have it frozen in sort of small little servings, so you can use just as much as you want. Once the ice cube trays are frozen, you can sort of put the cubes into a plastic bag in your freezer. So those are just some little tricks, because it does take a fair amount of time if you're simmering the mushrooms for 6 hours. So finding ways to make large batches and then preserve it can be really much more convenient. So here's just a little bit more about that double extraction method to get the full chemistry. So these 2 molecules at the bottom, the one on the left shows a polysaccharide, and the one on the right shows a triterpene, and it's the triterpene, so the ring-like structure, which is associated with rebalancing the immune system in the helper T1, helper T2 cells. So what the double extraction method does is it extracts the polysaccharide structure on the left in water, because the polysaccharides will be damaged by the alcohol, especially high alcohol. concentrations, like a 50% alcohol. However, the triterpenes on the right won't extract in water at all and needs the alcohol to be extracted. So basically you make 2 separate extracts and then you mix them together to get the full expression of the chemistry. And this is more just FYI for those of you who helping you to be more conscious consumers and make sure that the mushroom tincture you're spending money on is prepared in a way that makes it most bioavailable. So we're sort of coming to wrapping up a little bit. Here's sort of a summary. So are there any just sort of general questions about using the remedies that I mentioned? I have a few comments at the end, but I wanted to come back to this slide first.
Yeah, I'll give people a few minutes if they're, furiously typing in the chat box. Now's a great time to ask all the questions that you have, anything that wasn't covered that you'd like to know more about. We left plenty of time for questions with the time frame of this class, so happy to know what people want to know. So I'll give people a few minutes. I sure learned a lot.
Yeah.
And I apologize for the sneeze earlier. Like I said, my allergies are already
it was perfect. You should have sneezed when this slide was up.
Yeah.
Well, I can share a little bit more because a lot of what I was sharing is through sort of a Western physiological lens. So I wanted to, well, there's that. Yeah, so I mentioned, the goldenrod and ragweed thing. So I definitely want to encourage you all to help to spread the word about this common confusion between ragweed and goldenrod. I think part of it is wanting to defend goldenrod as a solution rather than a cause of allergies, but also a way to increase that wellness sovereignty and level of knowledge in our population because goldenrod is extremely abundant. So as you're thinking ahead to fall allergies, consider goldenrod as your friend rather than your foe. Yeah, so there's the. So contrary to popular belief, ragweed pollen, not goldenrod, causes hay fever. I also wanted to speak a little bit about springtime, which is kind of the what focuses on the front side of the handout. So from an Eastern perspective, some of my training is in Chinese 5-element theory. This time of year, I'm sorry, the slide got a little obscured down there on the left, but the Chinese liver, which is not exactly directly correlated with the way we think about the liver as the organ, it's sort of like a broader concept, but it does include the organ of the liver. Spring is associated with what's called the wood element. And it's kind of, we think about winter as like the seed stage of the plant, and summer is like the flower stage of the plant, and autumn is the fruit. So really when we're talking about spring, it's that seed to flower. It's the sprouting, it's the reaching towards the sun, emerging out of the soil. And so a healthy sort of wood element knows how to channel nourishment towards that ultimate goal. So that's a little bit what the first side of the document speaks to. And a lot of my teaching has been getting more directed to liberation politics and looking at ways to decolonize our bodies and show up more fully, especially listening more closely to the experiences of folks living in Black and brown bodies in our population. And an interesting way to think about the liver when it's as it relates to, for me in particular as a white person, one of the sort of common themes around awakening to racism and justice issues in our population is related to our ability to listen and cultivate empathy. So this idea of being available for the emotional processing of the stories that, of histories and things that we may not have been exposed to because we were protected from it, basically because of the color of our skin. So digestion and liver function is actually in many other traditions related to our capacity for empathy. And one of the best examples of this is comfort foods. So when I think about comfort food, I think about ice cream and baked goods. So essentially dairy, sugar, gluten. And these foods are actually quite challenging to digest, both for the digestive system, but also the liver. And so one of the explanations for why we're drawn to those foods when we're experiencing intense emotions is that because of the challenge in the digestion, it distracts us from dealing with the feelings, of processing the feelings, because we're processing challenging food instead. And you know, this isn't really something that we think about from a Western perspective, because we really only think about the physical body. We don't think about the mind-body connection. But many other healing philosophies consider that digestion relates to not just food, but also feelings. And so thinking about, for example, when you're digesting your food and when you're eating, trying not to also be reading the newspaper while you're eating your breakfast, because then you're trying to assimilate both your food and the information in the newspaper. So one way to think about the role of the liver and the digestion in liberation politics, and sort of the ways that all of us can show up as better listeners and participants in a more just society, is to support your liver as a way to increase your capacity for empathy. So that's just a seed or a food for thought. And if it's something that you're interested in, feel free to reach out and ask into it. But I love thinking about this mind-body connection, and also that our bodies exist in a collective, in a society, and how can we support our health and wellness to be better citizens in this society? Is another question.
Not too many questions coming in. Someone just asked, did I miss the mushroom broth recipe? Do you have like an actual recipe for the mushroom broth, or just sort of a how to do it?
Yeah, I would. So for the mushroom broth recipe, what I would do is just look up a recipe for bone broth, or you could even just look up a mushroom broth recipe. The Railyard Apothecary, which I'm highlighting in this slide right here, has a mushroom and root broth packet that you can just order from the online store, and there's instructions on that as well. But it's essentially, you know, putting, I would say, like a cup of dried mushrooms, and you might include some roots in there too, with 3 to 4 cups of water. And then you want to cover it so that the water doesn't boil off. And I like to use a crock pot, but you can absolutely use a stove top. You just want to make sure that, again, it's so hot that it doesn't, that all the water doesn't boil off. It's okay if it concentrates a little bit, but it's essentially making a tea with dried mushrooms. And the main thing is to simmer for at least 6 hours. And you can often reuse the mushrooms 2 or 3 more times. You just sort of keep using them until the water gets, you know, really pale and bland, and then you know that the mushrooms have kind of spent their medicine. So I wanted to highlight that the Railyard Apothecary is a great source for these herbs, as well as for herbal education. Website is railyardapothecary.com, but we are open to, with limited capacity, folks in masks at our location down in Battery Street. We're open 6 days a week. So if you're interested in learning more, accessing some of these herbs, we have a website and a web store, and there's also local delivery as well as curbside pickup still. So this could be a great way to follow up and get some of those herbs, or find them in your surrounding green spaces and local environment if you're comfortable with that. And then just a little bit about Spoonful Herbals. We do offer an apprenticeship every season. It's full for this season, but if you're interested in learning more and boosting your wellness sovereignty and learning about growing and harvesting and making plant medicines, that's something that we offer every growing season. We also offer backyard consulting and weed walks. So if you want to know more about the plant medicine in the land that you steward around your home, you can invite us out for a consultation. Our website is spoonfulherbals.org. And then right now we're offering herbal CSA shares. So that's 10 to 15 herbal remedies that we prepare over the course of the season. It's kind of like a home health care package that you get at the end of the season, featuring remedies that we've made throughout the year with our apprentices. So if you have any questions or want to learn more about that, or want to join our mailing list, let me know, or you can contact me through Carrie.
And I'll send all of this out, all of these links in email tomorrow, like I mentioned with the survey link, so I can send anything that you want to send, or pass along questions to you if people want to get in touch with me.
Great.
Someone asks, what leafy herbs would be good to promote DAO, the enzyme?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that enzyme. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, for supporting health and well-being, I go back to that wellness foundation. One of my favorite quotes from an herbalist and naturopath, Mary Bove, who's now retired, is she said, "If we support the physiology, then there's no room for pathology." So if you support the body, if you support the digestion, you get adequate rest. The body is a self-regulating, self-healing mechanism, and sometimes it's helpful to, to step away from the really detailed nuts and bolts understanding of the body and just support the body to do what it does in its own wisdom. What did you hear about the enzyme?
DAO is diamine oxidase, and it's an enzyme and nutritional supplement frequently used to treat symptoms of histamine intolerance.
Okay.
There's limited research on it, it looks like.
So it sounds like that's another antihistamine
Yeah.
strategy. So you could put it in sort of the category of antihistamines. And it's possible that some of the herbs I already mentioned, like the plantain and goldenrod and spring nettles, support that enzyme. But again, I think that I found the most results with kind of a broader approach, which includes also working on the immune system and helping to flush allergens from the body in the first place.
And Sharon asks, have you heard of blue poppy allergies? Sounds like a brand name, maybe, allergies?
I haven't heard of that. I'll often work with clients who are using existing supplements, and I'm really happy to look up what's in them, as well as what herbs or supplements are inside. I also look at the proportions or the amounts. And generally speaking, what I find with prepared over-the-counter herbal supplements is that the dosing is often not lining up with the recommended dose from the literature and from my training. So that there's some benefit to having a custom blend prepared. And that also gives you the flexibility to sort of really figure out what works for you. But it's hard for me to comment on it without seeing what's in it and what the proportions are.
Yep, and then just someone confirming the DAO to balance the excess histamine. But yeah, I already mentioned that. Yeah, if there's no more questions, like I said, I'll give people just a few more minutes in case there's anybody furiously typing their question in. But thank you all so much for attending tonight. I know I always learn so much when Katherine comes to teach. But thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your night, and hopefully we'll see you in another class soon. Bye.